Hello everyone, and welcome to the University of Law podcast and to our Diversity Matters series. My name is Beren Maddison, and I am the Staff Wellbeing and Engagement Partner and part of the Equality, Diversity, Inclusion team here at the University of Law. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Eva Piliari to discuss LGBTQ History Month. Eva, it's a pleasure to have you here today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Eva Piliari. My pronouns are she, her, and I am our university's LGBT rep. Thank you for inviting me onto the podcast.
It's great. It's lovely to have you. Being a student and involved in LGBTQ plus representation is a great starting point for our first question, which is, how do you feel that LGBTQ plus history is represented within the education sector?
So I think that universities promote LGBT History Month quite well. I think also just having roles such as LGBTQ plus reps in our university is a big help, especially since it's student-led, because it gives individuals opportunities to choose whether to approach staff members or classmates, given what's more comfortable for them.
That's completely fair. I think having both options makes it a safer space, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
And it's really good, I think. Universities are definitely using their kind of platform as an education provider to share insights and experiences and the history of our community, which is really good.
For me, I find that it's important for universities to share upcoming days that commemorate LGBT history, because it sheds light on past events, but it also informs people that might not know the history behind everything. I think it's a great starting point for allies as well.
No, absolutely. Allies, it's really good for that, because it gives them the opportunity to engage with the education side and to learn a bit more about the community as well. Like when I was at uni, we had a really rich LGBT history. So the student LGBT plus committee had we did a bit of a history dig, and we found all of the archives on all of the information that we had of where the committee had started, and we found that it went all the way back to the 1970s.
Oh, wow.
And loads of our members had been at the forefront of campaigns and activisms throughout that time. So around the age of consent, around the HIV and AIDS epidemic, improving legal protections. It was really amazing and a great reflective experience, because I was kind of sitting there what are the equivalent things that we're fighting for today, and how can I get involved? And it was huge. And I guess as well, thinking about what's been in the news recently and stuff, just outside of higher education, the fact that we're including appropriate LGBT education at different levels of the curriculum is a really significant milestone in this country, because it gives us so much better representation of LGBT history.
Yeah, I agree. I think support from universities help create a safer environment. It's more welcoming as well.
Do you think there's enough knowledge about LGBTQ history? Do you think we could do more? Do you think that people are becoming more aware of it at all?
So I think that LGBT history is well represented in the higher education sector. However, when it comes to compulsory education, so primary to secondary school, I think there is a lack. Yeah. From my personal experience, we didn't have anything at all. And it wasn't until I reached sixth form that I became more aware as well. So I think if there is even small talks in compulsory education, it helps, I guess, the younger generation of queer kids as well.
No, absolutely. And I was the same at school. There wasn't anything until we hit sixth form. And even then it was so closely guarded and sheepish talking about it. And if anything, we were kind of because a lot of people had figured out their sexuality or their gender identity by then. And we were kind of pushing a little bit to try and get more awareness and acknowledgement. And teachers were quite scared of doing it and scared of talking about it. But from what I've heard now, they've brought in some LGBT education in PSHE and stuff in different levels. So it's almost reassuring to know that future generations are getting that kind of representation that we didn't have as younger queer people that were trying to navigate all of that. So yeah, I think it's so important. I think as well we're still dealing with the impacts of Section 28, even though it's now like 25 years, or 20 years since it was repealed. But that, in terms of gagging teachers and gagging schools in what they could say and how they could support LGBT students, was really, really damaging. And that was in effect for like 25 years. So there's like 25 years worth of people that have been impacted by that. And it didn't just stop people talking about it. It stopped teachers stepping in when there was homophobia and when there was bullying, and it allowed that kind of ignorance to grow. So yeah. Another thing I think as well, when we're talking about like knowledge of LGBTQ history, is like social media. Like that can be such a good platform to promote stuff. And I've learned so much about our community just from like meeting people through Twitter and Instagram and like finding shared interests there. But like the way that it can be a platform for misinformation and like really horrible debates is concerning as well. And like you almost thinking about like education, we have to like almost challenge that misinformation now. So it's not just a case of like actually getting to educate people and talk about our history. It's like challenging all of the like stigma and lies and everything around it. So yeah.
So I agree as well. I think media is good and bad. I think like these past 10 years there has been an improvement,
definitely,
like in like TV shows or books. There's like much more representation as well. And I think like as the time progresses, I think information and knowledge would just become more accessible to everyone.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's so much accessibility. Accessibility is a really like key one, because I'm thinking like as perhaps like a teenager, like figuring out like your sexuality or gender identity, like being able to access like information and learn about different things that have happened and different identities is so important, because it gives you that space to explore it before you potentially like come out, which I know we'll talk about a little bit later as well. I think as well, like in this space, thinking about like, is there enough knowledge about LGBT history? Because of the nature of it and because of like what we've been through as a community, there's quite a lot that is still uncovered and still needs to be discovered, because back when it was it was a criminal offence to be gay, or there was huge discrimination and sort of ostracization. Like a lot of people had to hide that element of themselves. And so like when you're looking for LGBT history and references and things that might sort of indicate that about sexuality and gender identity, you have to really dig, and you have to always look beneath the surface. You have to look for things that might have been destroyed or lost, and it's such an ongoing thing. It's like as more people get to know it, like they're gonna kind of discover more and more. And that's I love that element of like, it could be so exciting, like there could still be so much history that we don't know about, but it's also quite a sad thing that we've lost quite a lot of it as well. So yeah. Do you have any comments on sort of why it's important? Because I mean, we both clearly really like LGBT history and we really like education and we're quite passionate about it. But for some of the people listening, why would it be important for us to promote LGBT history?
So I think if people become more aware, then there is less chance of bullying occurring as well, and just discrimination in general. Absolutely,
yeah. And education's so important from that perspective, because it starts the conversation, doesn't it? Like a lot of bullying, a lot of hatred comes out of like ignorance and fear, and it probably sounds quite deep, but like if we can start by educating and by talking about our history, it brings that human aspect to it of like we're all just people trying to exist and not get persecuted, basically. So yeah, no, there's that real kind of human element of it. We get to challenge hate and discrimination. I mean, also it's just really interesting history. Like it's all of these kind of bits that we don't learn about at school necessarily, or it's not at the forefront of like history and what we talk about. So it's kind of like a whole world underneath that we get to discover as well. But yeah, like, I mean, we've talked about LGBT in education in general, but thinking about like here at the University of Law and potentially at other universities as well, like, do you feel like we can provide a safe environment at university, and how does that differ from other areas of society?
So I think our university does a great job, for the use of societies, representation officers, and just information shared. So we get emails of upcoming events or like days as well, which I know the asexuality day is coming up next week.
Yeah.
So I think they did a great job at that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like societies and the representation is really, it's really good. And like as a staff member, I've always felt welcomed and safe here. I mean, I work within the equality, diversity, inclusion team, so I might have a bit of an advantage because I know all about like all of the work that we're doing in this area, and that makes me feel really reassured. And like we've got the staff networks, they're really valuable. And thinking like, for students that are going into the workplace, like it would be really reassuring to know that like your employer has a staff network and has like a care for inclusion and diversity. So yeah, that's really nice. And thinking back to when I was a student as well, like it was such a period of like exploring yourself and like finding out a little bit more about you, being a bit more independent, and having that student society like where you could kind of come together and like meet people and run campaigns and like get involved in like all kinds of things across the university and sort of share your experiences like as a queer person or member of the community. Like it really gave me like that chance to develop into like a proud gay man, I guess, like and to learn more as well, because I think there's always like when you're part of the community, you always feel like you almost know everything, or like you think, oh yeah, like I know about that. And then like when you get the chance to learn a bit more and to like see these insights into the history, you're like, I don't know anything, but the more I learn, the more I'm excited by it.
And I also think that with all the support that university gives us, it also helps people feel less isolated, because I know sometimes, if you need to reach out for help, you don't know anyone close to you. So
it's why that like promotion of it and like being visible is so important, because when you're trying to reach out for help and you don't know where to go, that's such a barrier in itself. Like, so knowing that there's a really clear like representative or a society, or that if you speak to a wellbeing advisor, they're going to be supportive and inclusive, and they're not going to judge you for any, for your sexuality or your gender identity. Like those are really important things to like promote and be proud of at ULaw. So I think it's great here. But it's always a journey. I think like we can't get too complacent and be like, yeah, this is fine, because like there's always more that we can do, but we've got a really strong basis. So
how do you think universities, workplaces, and other organizations can create a safe environment for someone to be open about their identity?
So from my experience of like working in this kind of area, I think, and also lived experience of working at different organizations and going to university and seeing people's or the organization attempts at like creating these safe environments, I think it's really important to take a considered approach, sort of take your time with it and make sure that every aspect is considered, and also engaging with members of the community. So if you're going for just an overall inclusive campus, make sure that you have a diverse pool of students and staff to kind of engage with. If you're looking specifically at different communities, then engage them in a way that makes sure that they're kind of listened to and they get to feed into it. Because there's so many different elements to create in that safe environment. You need visibility and representation, as I mentioned before. You need those kind of spaces like staff networks and societies where people can connect and socialise with other members of the communities that they're part of. And sort of clear, meaningful allyship as well, I think, is really important. So even having representation at a top level is great as well, but even just having staff that are allies and quite vocal and engage with those kind of areas is really key. So training and education, making commitments and acting on them, like those are really, really important. I think the other thing is like reassurance as well. And it's also the same from like a well-being perspective. Like, you need to make it really clear that like discrimination or like inappropriate behavior isn't acceptable, and that we have like a code of conduct for members of, for example, the university or the organization, and also having like a clear and easy route to report concerns and issues around that, and reassuring people that, you know, there won't be negative repercussions because they've reported something, and that it will be taken seriously. So, I mean, those are just a few things off the top of my head, and there's sort of different levels in them. And I think trying to get all of them in and think about how you can perhaps even do like outreach and support causes related to those different communities is something that you could even build into that, just to have that really holistic approach. Kind of brings us on to like the next question around when like allyship isn't so successful and perhaps is a little bit superficial, or even performative. Some people have called some examples. Do you have any examples of like performative allyship that you've seen, or allyship that hasn't quite landed properly?
I think maybe when people change stuff to a pride flag, you know, just for the like month of pride, you know, and also just they have just pride collections limited time only. I think it doesn't really show support the way they want to achieve it.
Yeah, particularly if it's like an organization that's selling something, like it, if it's just for the month, it kind of, and they're not clear about what they do outside of that month to support the community, it's suddenly kind of like, are you just wanting my money? Are you like, you just kind of try to take me for a fool a little bit? But like, yeah, it's definitely, when it comes to the organizations, like if, again, it's that considered approach. It's like, yes, we're going to support during Pride Month and we're going to be visible during Pride Month, but what do we do outside of that to keep that momentum going? And how can we support change? And sometimes as well, like some of those companies might have links and like investments in unethical things that like directly conflict with that sort of pride statement. So like, I mean, very loosely off the top of my head, supporting the World Cup and funding that in a country that potentially, you know, doesn't have the laws and protections for LGBT people, but then having a Pride Month campaign and saying that you support LGBT rights, there's like a little bit of disconnect there. That can always be a challenge, and I know that people are quite vocal about that, and it can get quite challenging for the organisations and the people that are in those organisations that had good intentions but then feel a bit attacked for that, a little bit. I mean, thinking about university as well, like back at my old university, they brought in rainbow lanyards for staff, and it was just a way to show allyship, like staff that you know, wanted to show that they were an ally could get a rainbow lanyard. But students took it to mean that those staff were sort of like specially trained to like handle LGBT like not disclosures, but like support students that were LGBT if they came forward with like a query about it. And then when it kind of came out that that wasn't the case and it was just sort of a lanyard, and actually people were approaching these staff and asking them for support, and the staff weren't able to support them or, you know, turn them away because they weren't trained to do that. There was a bit of backlash, and we had to do some work to try and like make some training and give some support to the staff so that the lanyards had a bit more meaning to them. And I guess it's like that layers thing of like, you can have like visibility and representation, and then you can think about like support and training, and then sort of move it into those deeper levels of allyship. But yeah, I like to think of it a little bit as a journey, because like a lot of the work that I do is about sort of improving support and improving inclusion and all of those kind of things. And I don't like to be too negative. I like to think of it as sort of like, right, where are we now, and how can we be even better allies? What can we do in the short term to really support our staff and students? How can we look to the long term for like goals? Because some things take ages to change, and actually if we're working towards them, like that's great, but we need to be realistic about timeframes. And the other thing I think is as well, like taking feedback on board. So regardless of what you do as an ally, there's probably going to be a time where you slip up a little bit or you're not perfect, because we're all human. But if you get that feedback and you kind of shut down and you kind of take away your allyship or withdraw, then that's quite superficial. Whereas if you can actually use it to be an even better ally and sort of reflect and improve, like, that's amazing. That's a learning opportunity. That's even better, really. But yeah, probably chatted for a bit too long now. So our next question is about coming out, and as I'm sure you know, there's a lot of focus around coming out as quite an important event, but it's definitely not a once in a lifetime experience. So do you personally feel that you're coming out each time that you meet new individuals, and do you feel like you're pressured into explaining your personal situation? Like, what are your thoughts around coming out, basically?
Yeah, so I definitely agree that coming out isn't once in a lifetime. There are many different ways you can come out as well. So like you can tell your parents, but then at the same time, if you're walking down the street holding your partner's hand, it's a heteronormative society, so automatically you are coming out. I also found that at the beginning for me, it was a bit scary, but then over time, I became more confident in my identity.
Yes, yeah. No, I think very similar reflections for myself. Like, I think it's important to say as well, like, the first time, there's a lot of pressure around the first time, but like, depending on your circumstances and who you're coming out to, like, it can be just as nerve-wracking or significant, like the 50th time you have to do it, or the first time. Or the first time might be really chill because it's with someone that you're really comfortable with, and then there's a few more times where it's a bit more difficult. And because the response is so like dependent on the person you're coming out to, like, it's quite vulnerable and unique regardless, because there's always a little bit of you that's like, how are they going to react? How am I going to handle this situation? But I think with time, and like when you have the support around you as well for a long time, you feel much more confident, and you know that actually, even if you do have a bad experience or an awkward experience with coming out to someone, it's not going to define you, and it's not the end of the world, because there's lots of support available and there's lots of support around you, hopefully, as well. When I came out, so I knew that I had like a really supportive family. Like, I already knew they'd be fine with it, and I thought it was a bit annoying, really, to be honest. I was a bit kind of rebellious about it, because I just felt like, why should I have to come out? Like, it shouldn't really be an issue. Like, if I bring a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a partner home, like, it won't matter, and it shouldn't matter. So the only time it really matters is when I date someone. So I was kind of quite clear that I didn't really want to go through like a coming out process of having like a big statement when actually I wasn't dating anyone, and I wanted to wait. And then it turned out that I didn't date anyone for like 2 years. So, took its time anyway. Everyone was kind of like, well, we kind of guessed already. But yeah, it's nowadays, like, I'm very comfortable, and like I think I'm very lucky in my experience that like I can be that comfortable. But yeah, coming out it's exciting as well. It does feel like a weight off your shoulders sometimes, because you get to show your true self as well.
So as it's LGBT History Month, what would you say are some of the key milestones in the UK LGBT history?
Yeah, so sometimes when we think about LGBT history, we have quite an American view of it. So we think about the Stonewall riots in 1969, but in the UK, the landscape was a little bit different, and the campaigning was a little bit more focused around laws and protections, and there's a lot of activism around sort of the issues affecting the LGBT community at the time. So some key milestones would be things like the decriminalisation of homosexuality in 1967. So that was only in England and Wales initially. So again, with the UK, you've then got devolution, which means that Scotland and Northern Ireland sometimes don't bring in these laws until a little bit later. So there's a little bit of a difference there. But then also at this point, the age of consent was still higher than for straight couples. So there was a lot of campaigning around reducing the age of consent to have equality between all sort of sexualities. And this took quite a few years. This wasn't until sort of 2000 that they were able to get this. So that's what, like 30 something years afterwards. I mean, even thinking about some of the protections and the things that we might take for granted now, so like marriage and civil partnership and things like that, we didn't get equal marriage until 2013, so that's only 10 years, and civil partnerships came in 2004, so we've only really had those for sort of 20 years, and actually that's not that long at all. And when we think about sort of transgender rights as well, the Gender Recognition Act was only brought in 2004 as well, so that meant that trans people could legally change their gender, but before that there wasn't any sort of legal support for them in that sense. I mean, we've got legislation now as well that protects from discrimination, so that was in 2010, and that was quite a big thing because that meant that we had a real clear approach to dealing with protection against any protected characteristic, but including being part of the LGBT community. But despite all of that as well, we did have back steps, and one of the biggest parts of UK LGBT history, I think, is Section 28. So this was essentially an act that meant that local authorities and schools were restricted from promoting homosexuality. It's brought in 1998, and it wasn't abolished until 2003. And basically what that meant was teachers and people that sort of supported children as they grew up weren't allowed to acknowledge or even represent LGBT identities in any kind of way. And they were threatened with disciplinary action if they did discuss this. So what this led to wasn't just that people didn't get educated on LGBT issues and history, but actually it meant that when kids were being bullied for being gay or being LGBT, teachers couldn't step in, and teachers often just ignored it because they were scared of the repercussions of supporting LGBT that people there. So it had a really, really bad effect, and it meant that actually a lot of that hatred and that misinformation spread because nobody was challenging it, and nobody was getting educated on the realities of just being LGBT and the human side of it that I think we talked about as well. This was also at the time when there was the AIDS epidemic was still continuing, and it was still affecting our community, and actually education was really, really important to sort of tackle that issue. So yeah, it was really, really harmful, and it was law for 25 years. So, you know, it's affected generations of people, and actually we're now seeing that, you know, education is in schools on these kind of topics, which is really, really positive, but it takes a lot of time to sort of undo some of the impacts of that we can still see today, where people have, you know, discriminatory views perhaps, or, you know, have misinformation that leads them to feel very different from LGBT communities. So yeah, there's a lot of milestones, and there's some really interesting history. I mean, there's allegiances between the LGBT community and the unions during like workers' strikes. That was a very historic and important moment back during the miners' strikes in the 70s and 80s. And there's also sort of the campaigning that happened globally around the HIV and AIDS epidemic. So sort of trying to get more acknowledgement and support and research from the government to try and tackle that, which unfortunately took quite a long time because there were a lot of governments that didn't want to engage with it. But if you look into the history, a lot of museums now do like sort of exhibitions on the rich history that we have and the history of campaigning, and it's so interesting, I have to say, and it's so important to learn as well, because we can see that for all the progress we make, there's still very much a possibility that we could slip back and we could lose rights, or people could bring in legislation that impacts us and that harms us. So it's really important to keep that in the forefront of our mind as we try and make progress and move forward. Thank you so much for joining us, Eva. It was been lovely chatting to you. And yeah, thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you for inviting me.